Championing ESG principles is more than an act of responsible investment. It's a clarion call for corporate accountability in a world starved for transparency, justice, and peace. Both investor voice and stakeholder voice are not just essential, but critical to ensuring corporate accountability. Our voices collectively pave the way for a moral economy and a sustainable future. As stewards of assets and change makers, it becomes our duty to transcend the fleeting allure of gains from anti-democratic practices or racial injustice. At ICCR, we must not let the politics of any day, anywhere in the world, including in our home nation, to distract us from who we are. We are neither the right nor the left. We are the unwavering moral center. I'm going to introduce our great and esteemed panel of change makers, some of the best in the nation. And first, I would want us all to welcome President at Florida Public Services Union, Alphonso Mayfield, co-founder, Black Voters Matter, Cliff Albright, and Director of Sustainable Investing at Zevin Asset Management, Marcela Pinilla.
There is a poem that says, the South is where we send people that we want to forget about. We stash them away. And to live in this country is very much to live in two countries. It is to live in a democracy that is the United States, and it is to live in the separate apartheid fascist states of America, where our rights and our liberties are constantly being eroded. Anti-ESG is just bad business. And if you think about it from a very narrow place, it's a perpetuation of a status quo that excludes people of color, specifically centers anti-Black racism, and it's a bubble-making machine. So the idea that we're gonna ignore the impacts that racism and structural racism has on our economy by limiting markets, and that's gonna grow our economy, is absurd. The idea that we're gonna ignore that our climate is all over the place and that we're getting hit with hurricanes left and right in Florida, and our property insurance is going up and energy prices are going up, and we're gonna ignore that, and that's gonna grow markets, is also absurd. To say that we're not going to acknowledge ESG and push an anti-frame is a perpetuation of bubbles that is risky for everyone, especially to our members in their communities who rely on their pensions to be able to retire, and their communities that rely on those dollars to drive local economies.
What we learned, and a reporter named Judd Lakem did some really good work on this, exposing some of the companies that were giving donations to the very people in Georgia who were pushing the voter suppression laws. And so we started to call them out. And we actually did, and there were some well-known names on this list, right? Coca-Cola, Delta, Home Depot, UPS, right? All these based in Georgia. And so we started to call them out, and we did a corporate accountability campaign. We did some full-page ads in nationally recognized newspapers, including Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It started to get a lot of attention across the country. You could show one slide that just shows like some coverage it got on MSNBC. There were calls for boycotts of Delta and Coca-Cola. It eventually led to a group of Black executives from around the country to come together to say that companies need to take more action on voter suppression and on democracy issues, which then in turn led to like 200 other companies signing a letter calling for expanded voting rights and voter access and protections of democracy. So it was a thing, right? But it wasn't enough. Right. And so, but what we've been trying to do during that moment and beyond is to spread the message that democracy is good for business, right? Just like Alphonso said, democracy is good for business. Fascism is not. And if you think that you're exempt for it, one of the companies, when we shifted the corporate accountability from Georgia and their voter suppression law to Florida, which had its own version of its own voter suppression law, one of the companies that we tried to call in was Disney. And Disney wasn't very helpful, I just have to say, on the voting issues. But eventually they were more helpful on some other issues, which led them to what? To then get targeted by the same governor and the same state representatives that they had been giving donations to and that we tried to call them in on. So somehow they thought they were going to be exempt when we came to them talking about voting rights, but then they started to feel the pressure, right? And so nobody is exempt. If Disney and some Disney princesses and some heroes can't be exempt, right? No, if Mickey can't be exempt, nobody is exempt from the authoritarianism and the fascism and the anti-democracy movement that we are seeing sweeping the country.
So we developed a framework that helps us put racial equity at the front of our process. We describe it as a lens that it's applied to companies to identify and change inequitable practices, policies, and behaviors to advance meaningful racial, ethnic diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're all familiar with that, but now overlay that with these threats to our work, to the democratic process, and you really start seeing the ramifications. I just wanted to touch on how we actually do this and what's changed for us at Zevin as we've been learning more and more of our history and how we can reckon with our with this inconvenient truth. First of all, in the traditional ESG research process, we look for material risk. We look for where are the risks, where are the impacts. But at this point in time, we can no longer think of ourselves as the know-it-alls of like, we know what the answer is. We know what the answer is because we get to connect with you on the ground and hear from the voices of the lived experience. And we start integrating that very early on in the research process. We also want to acknowledge that we're not in an echo chamber where we think we know best, like I said. And we bring these examples to the companies that we speak to, and we say, look, these threats to democracy, framing it as a systemic risk, reveals that you are not just as a company reacting to the world around you, you're actively participating and shaping it. So how are you doing that? And we find that the failures of our democracy early on are still reflected in our current institutions and our current systems. So how as investors can we deconstruct and slice a company or an industry to understand those areas of inequity and where companies interfere? And I'm talking about political spending and lobbying at the core of companies pushing back and trying to shape policy locally and federally.
So Alphonso, I have a question for you. So you touched on it a little bit about some of the laws on the state level that are being passed. You talked a little bit about child labor, and actually throughout this conference, we've heard a lot of data about worker justice. We just heard a panel just before us just before this panel on environmental justice. And since there's so much work being done on the local and state level, how do you foresee these anti-democratic attacks impacting progress in areas that we desperately need progress in?
That's a really good question. So I think so the answer to the question narrowly is it depends on what we do collectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the bottom line answer.
Mm-hmm.
But where it's going, if it's uninterrupted, is you're going to see a further erosion and a further narrowing of who are core decision makers. I think that the Disney thing, regardless of how you feel about Disney, is really interesting because what is happening is there is a weaponizing and operationalization of attacking dissent. So if I agree with you in one area, then I attack you and I limit your ability to be able to do business. And I say, I'm going to pick who's winners and who's losers in an economic and market environment, right? And it doesn't seem that way, but that's giving too much power to the state. While at the same time that's happening, you have a direct attack on workers to say that we want to limit your bargaining power. And we want to take and we want to make it harder for you to speak with your voice and to be able to drive wages and be able to enhance economic independence of your family. And at the same time that is happening, there's an attack on voters saying that what you vote on matters less and less, that we're going to preempt and take power away from local governments and from local elections and put them in the hands of fewer and fewer hands. So there is an oligarchic kind of centralization of power that is taking place that is making sure that a very small group of people make the decisions and pick who wins and who loses, right? And so there's a core question of whether or not we agree politically. We all should agree that when the democracy functions at its best, that it creates an economy that allows more people to enter, that it creates more dynamism, and also allows better outcomes for our communities.
I often hear in investor circles that, taking a strong position on, racial equity or racial justice is just too political. But I always kind of think about this notion that racial injustice is a human rights issue. It's not a political issue, right? Because we're not negotiating. The minute it gets dragged into the public square, we're talking really about negotiating the very existence of people now at this point. So I want to hear from you, how do you help investors sort of reconcile the political aspect of this versus the human rights aspect of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Two ways that come to mind, and one of them is by pointing out exactly what you just said, right? That there are some political questions that are up for debate, right? Whether or not the marginal tax rate needs to be, 25% or 20%, or exactly which medicines get to be exempted from which, whatever. There's some things that are open for debate. My humanity is not open for debate. Absolutely. Right? Our human rights is not open for debate, whether that's based on race or gender or identification, that's not up for debate. And getting and sometimes in the media coverage of this, like of politics as a horse race, right? Who's winning, who's losing, who's up, who's down, what the polls say, instead of fundamentally looking at, is this something that is good for humanity and good for democracy? None of this is good for business. Like, what is good for business about having the number one cause of death of young people being gun violence? How is that good for business? How is it good for business that you don't know if you can go to the theater or the shopping center or the mall or to school and feel safe? How is that good for business? How is being against healthcare good for business? You want sick workers? You want uneducated workers or consumers? Maybe some do, I don't know. But in my book, I actually have an MBA degree. That's not really thought of when we talk about the widgets and all that. I've not been in an economics class that says it's good to have sick, uneducated, unsafe workers. That's just not good for business.
So Marcela, can you help bridge the gap between everything that Alphonso and Cliff have just laid out and to our responsibility, not only as investors, but shareholder advocates and the like?
Absolutely. Yeah. Whether you're an active manager, an asset owner, you have a way to address this, and you probably already do. It's just about looking at those areas of inequity and reconciling with our history. And I know we're all doing that work, but I think that's the beginning, right? We see the racial inequity poses systemic risks. Mm-hmm. We know that we cannot divest it away. We cannot diversify inequity away. So we need to do something. And that, like I said before, the intentionality of owning corporations that we know have extractive revenue models or that rely on very low cost labor pools. These are the people we're talking about, including ourselves. Which side are we on? If we're long-term investors, we need to think that investing in the workforce is a good thing, that pro-democracy, pro-freedom of association actions are pro-democratic actions. So 2 examples that I wanted to highlight that really get at me in the gut is Wells Fargo that said, oh, we're going to do a racial equity audit, but then they underwrote a prison bond. That is a disconnection. And I know the folks at SEIU that filed that are going to keep the pressure on Wells Fargo because that is one of those misalignments. The other example is Kroger that employs nearly 500,000 people across the country. In a recent survey results showing that 1 in 5 of surveyed Kroger employees rely on food stamps. So Kroger's just externalizing that wage suppression and that lack of quality jobs and quality living to the government, and that an already weak social safety nets that exist. So I think that in the work that we're doing at Zevin, we are reimagining with RJI, with ICCR, of course, so many folks, reimagining what this democracy could look like.
So Alphonso, my question for you is, how does all this also impact public pension funds?
I mean, it puts them at risk. I mean, I think I'm going to actually make an analogy that's probably broader than just the pension fund. So I think, everybody's seeing what's going on nationally, politics in the House of Representatives, right? Regardless to where you sit politically on that, first time in our nation's very long history, or pretty short history in some regards, that we've had a Speaker of the House taken out. The level of volatility that creates and the level of uncertainty that creates. Imagine being a mother or a father or a grandmother or a grandfather who has to rely on your pension to be able to get you through the rest of your life. And the choppiness that's created in the market just by that alone. How many of us in this room can say with the fullness of our being and would be willing to put their life on the line and at risk to say that you believe that in 10 years we will still be in a democratic republic? And you'd be willing to bet everything on it? Can't say that. And so the protection of both of those things, whether how you feel about capitalism is how you feel about capitalism, how we feel about Marx, how we feel about markets, but the ability to be able to protect that system is underpinned by our ability to be able to protect democratic institutions. And I think that what we have done is on two different sides. From an investor perspective, we have invested on both sides of the table and not really cared of the outcome. And I think from a citizen perspective, we have been unbelievably passive. Now's a moment where in a very short amount of time, we have to lean in to protect everything, because if we don't, everything comes off the table.
Given what each of you have shared, can you connect the dots for us to highlight the ramifications? Alphonso, you already pretty much touched on this, but perhaps Cliff and Marcela, you can also weigh in on this. Highlight the ramifications for the broader U.S. economy.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I talk a lot about the challenges to this democracy and in particular the challenge to Black and Brown and other marginalized groups' voting powers, part of what we come up against is this kind of this notion of American exceptionalism, right? That, things only get better, the daisies grow, everything things are always, history's moving forward. And that's just not true, right? History can go backwards. People can actually lose rights. Part of the reason I believe that Reconstruction is one of the least taught periods in this country's history and in our education system is because when you really learn about it and you learn about some things that happened in Reconstruction and that there was Black governors and senators and Congress people, and then all of a sudden there wasn't, right? Then you start to see that rights can be granted, a whole amendment or 3 amendments can be passed, but you can still find yourself within 10 years in Jim Crow America.
We cannot have a fully thriving economy if we don't have full participation. So right now we have a bunch of policies and practices, as you all know, in companies that want to hold back or not give opportunity or to BIPOC folks. And what does that do to the workforce at a local level, at a very much broader level? We know that wage suppression is happening. We talked about this yesterday. We know that we're using child labor. We know that business models are broken out there. What are the areas that we as investors can wield our influence and show up and point out these policies and practices? I think that preserving a democracy starts with the individual. I really think that, and everyone in this room is going to go out there and engage a company or talk to an executive or talk to a skeptic and say, oh, I want to show up for racial equity. Well, how do we do that? And carry on with your work. Just show up where you see that there is no BIPOC folks around the table, or we left out the fact that the most disadvantaged are not getting the treatment they deserve, or the shadow workforce, the contracted workforce that we are not very aware of because 10Ks don't disclose our shadow workforce. So all of this is uncovering these inequities and carrying on with the work we do, because it's not like we are not doing it. We just need to put racial equity first to fortify the democracy that we have, that we want.
I was trying to think, if I was going to ask you to do two things and kind of reduce it to a point, what would it be? I would say talk to investors and companies and understanding that in the same way we would invest in an emerging market in another place, where we would have to build the scaffolding to figure out that the market would exist. BIPOC, people of color, women are a market here that needs to be invested in. And specifically in the South, where you have so much capital that's coming in because of the IRA, electric vehicles being created, and all the related markets, that can go down two roads. It can go down a road where it is set up in a very poor way and people are excluded and there is money left on the table, and there's a way that it can be done where people are included and that market explodes and it create an unbelievable amount of yield and wealth for a generation. That should be what we're looking toward. When Detroit was on fire, it was on fire for workers and for industry. We can do that again in the South, but there has to be a level of inclusion and thoughtfulness about that. That's one thing. The second thing I would ask is, if you're going to invest in something, we don't have to agree on the politics. But agree to invest in preserving the institution of the democracy, because whether or not we agree or disagree, we should be able to debate and disagree, and that the decision is made by us and not by, in some cases, unelected, or in some cases, a very small amount of gerrymandered electeds that are not leveraging and levying what the popular will.
Well, that concludes our panel. Thank you very much for giving us the time and space to talk about this very critical and important issue. And I guess it's lunchtime.